Alarm outside headquarters of Silicon Valley Bank in Santa Clara, California today.
They just came out and told us that the bank is shut down.
SVB, the 16th largest bank in the U.S. with $175 billion in deposits, is now the biggest American bank to fail since the 2008 financial crisis.
Hey there, my name is James Lee. Welcome to my channel 5149, where I talk business, politics, and society. And today, I think we need to closely scrutinize the demise of Silicon Valley Bank. Is this just another case of greed, perhaps even fraud in America's fraught banking industry? Or is there something else going on, something developing beneath the surface that is perhaps much more alarming that we should be paying more attention to?
A rough week for the banking industry.
The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank.
The second biggest bank collapse in U.S. history.
The Silicon Valley Bank collapsed on March 10 after a run on deposits doomed the tech-focused lenders' plans to raise fresh capital. WSJ banking reporter Rachel Ensign explains how this crisis unfolded and what could happen next.
During the pandemic, Silicon Valley Bank had gotten all of these deposits. Their deposits tripled. It was a huge influx. And they did what banks do. They took some of the deposits and made loans, but they also invested a lot of them in securities, which are pretty safe. Some issues had been bubbling under the surface at Silicon Valley Bank since the Federal Reserve started raising rates. When rates rose, the bonds fell in value. It's not a big problem for you unless you have to go and sell the bonds.
Couple of takeaways there. Safe investments, albeit illiquid, and also subject to the Fed's rate manipulation. This kind of nuance is all sort of jumbled and lost in much of the corporate news coverage that we see today. For example, Silicon Valley's greed and avarice have finally come home to roost in SVB collapse. Irony, anybody? CNBC shouting greed? Maybe a little bit like the pot calling the kettle black, for lack of a better analogy. Citing the New York Times, quote, "The failure of Silicon Valley Bank was caused by a run on the bank. The company was not, at least until clients started rushing for the exits, insolvent or even close to insolvent." A bank run on a not even close to insolvent bank. Odd, to say the least.
Is the Fed working on a digital dollar? We are actually evaluating that. Most major countries are now looking at the possibility of having a digital currency.
The digital dollar, how does this all connect? I've talked a lot about central bank digital currencies in the past. I've done several videos about this. But to summarize, CBDCs are digital forms of sovereign currencies issued by the central bank, which can be more convenient, but will necessarily, by design, compromise your personal privacy and autonomy by handing over more power to centralized institutions and give them the ability to potentially control and socially engineer behavior at a societal level. And the US, along with many other countries, are all working to usher in such a system.
So central bankers belatedly admit, oh, now that you've mentioned it, yes, banks create the money supply. So let's abolish that now. And also, by the way, let's abolish cash. So what should we do? Well, introduce digital cyber currency that central banks issue and control, and thereby gain total control over all economic transactions, decisions, and the whole lot you've just heard from the CEO of the GDI. The overarching trend of the 20th century is concentration of power in the hands of the few. That's what we have to keep in mind. We have to work against this. We don't want to have these unaccountable central planners making decisions. We need decentralization, and the solution, therefore, is to maintain public money in the hands of local community banks, decentralize decision-making, give local people the power in the form of local public banks and local not-for-profit community banks.
All right, it would be irresponsible for me to claim that there is some sort of grand conspiratorial plot amongst global elites to deliberately take out regional banks one by one with the goal of consolidating the supply of money in larger, more centrally controlled banks, which will necessarily cede more and more power to central banks like the Federal Reserve over time. But if an opportunity like this were to come along, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing for any central bank to seize such an opportunity to increase their influence and power. Because guess what? The Fed does have the option to make available more funding to help assure banks, especially those with sound but perhaps illiquid assets, have the ability to meet the needs of all their depositors. which they are doing because the reality is no current bank, regardless of size, can withstand a large bank run. But Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, what are they? They are regional, mid-sized banks with rich and influential clients in powerful sectors like tech and crypto. And wink, wink, they chose to let those banks die. Carefully, of course. Quote, naturally, the late Sunday evening announcements and dramatic actions to protect those who had lent money to a bank will raise the specter of the 2008 financial crisis and the trillions of dollars of bailouts and lending showered on the financial industry as it was on the precipice of total collapse. The regulators and Treasury, however, took pains to frame their announced plans Sunday as not a bailout, even if they're not entirely normal. Other lenders to these banks and shareholders will not receive any money from the Fed, Treasury, or FDIC. Instead, the FDIC will use the money in its deposit insurance fund to make depositors whole and then recoup it by getting a special payment from the FDIC member institutions that pay into the deposit insurance fund. Principled and disciplined they look, saving the little guys while sticking it to big bad Wall Street. All the while, the reality is we've just lost a few of our regional mid-sized banks. But guess what? The deposits of some of their highest profile clients are still intact, ready to be deployed elsewhere. This is from Reuters. JP Morgan, other big US banks flooded with new clients post SVB collapse. Well, that's convenient, isn't it? The money of high profile clients being transferred from a regional bank to a national bank. What's one way to control people? You control their money. Once again, to reiterate Professor Richard Werner's point, if we are indeed inching closer to a world where transactions are facilitated via a central bank digital currency, the Federal Reserve, the central banks, the government are just not going to be incentivized to support an ecosystem where there is a proliferation of small to medium-sized regional and community banks, because that paradigm necessarily means that the decision-making power is decentralized, spread across many different groups of people, creating an environment where groups, perhaps groups with different ideas and worldviews, can have a say in the world. Look, Silicon Valley Bank is not some fallen bastion of a free and just banking system. Bonuses paid to executives, insider dumping shares prior to the bank run, the rich getting richer, that is all still true. My point today is just to draw some attention, and I think well-deserved attention, to the aftermath of the SVB fallout and what the future of the financial system could look like. And I hate to say it, it is kind of looking like a world where more and more power is concentrated into the hands of fewer and fewer unelected people with a much different worldview and a much different agenda than probably you and I have in mind. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. This is obviously still a developing story, but one I think it would be wise for us to look beyond maybe the technical aspects of SVB and what exactly caused the bank to collapse and fail, and look at the broader picture of the whole financial ecosystem and what it could look like in the future if more and more money started flowing into fewer and fewer banks. What do you think? What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comment section below. And please, if you do find my work valuable, all I ask is you take a second to like this video, share it, subscribe to my channel, hit that notification bell so we can stay in touch with each other. As always, thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you next week.